All right, thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate it. Christmas is one of my favorite subjects. I've been revisiting it every year for 31 years now, believe it or not, since 1993, when I did the very first Christmas 100 years ago for Metropulse. And it really surprised and actually shocked me that year for reasons I'll get into a little bit later. But it's a fascinating study, partly because to realize that there was a time in Knoxville and in most of America that we did not celebrate Christmas and perhaps didn't even know what it was in the early days. And also a time when it went far out of control and was a much bigger, noisier, at least, thing than it is today. So we'll be talking just a little bit about both of those things, but just to give you a kind of a background on Christmas that in such a way that we've talked about before, we're always finding new stuff about the history of Christmas, and we tell this story in our book, Knoxville Christmas, which is an expanded version. It's not just a new edition, but this is, you might have seen our previous book of this title that came out 4 or 5 years ago. But this is more colorful, has a lot more stuff in it. It's 120 pages long, has several stories, and has a kind of a fully told story about the history of about the story of literature and how it affected American celebrations of Christmas, and specifically in Knoxville. But also has the most full account I've written so far about the chaos of 1893, the Saturnalia, as they called it in retrospect, when it was something like a street riot that went on for days. But all that's in that one book, A Knoxville Christmas, which is looks like a stocking stuffer to me. But anyway, want to just give a quick background on the evolution of Christmas in Knoxville, because we're always learning just a little bit more about this fascinating subject. Paul, do we have the first image on the? Yeah, I decided to show this picture of a church I'm pretty familiar with, First Presbyterian downtown, just because this is one of the very few remnants of 1790s, early 1800s Knoxville as it was. And I just wanted to mention that most of the people buried in this graveyard probably never celebrated Christmas, and there, in fact, some of them perhaps never heard of it. Christmas in its early days, it was Knoxville, for one thing, was preoccupied with practical needs in the early days of protection and survival on the frontier. And also the fact that the people who lived here were from all over the place. They were from the Northeast, they were from the Deep South, they were from Europe, from England, from Ireland, from one of them was from Spain, who lived here, and they didn't have enough of any one group of people to have a prevalent culture. So they didn't celebrate any holidays except for the 4th of July, the brand new holiday at the time. But it's interesting that a fellow named Washington Irving from New York began. He is best known as a fiction writer of course of well-known stories like Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But he is a guy that got very curious about the old English custom of Christmas, which had kind of fallen out of favor even in England. By the 1600s. Christmas was banned during the Cromwell era, and after that, it was kind of the age of reason, and it didn't really come back that much. But he was interested in this early medieval era Christmas that was celebrated in England, and he told some stories about a fictional family that lived in the countryside and still celebrated the old Christmas. And he described how this all the interesting and kind of traditions they had, having the Yule log and things like that. And this got popular not just in America, where he was from, but in England itself. And people in England got curious about their own past and what their great grandparents celebrated this holiday. This kind of started to pick up a little bit. And around 1820 is when you start seeing some people in Tennessee celebrating Christmas. In 1820, we know that the Knoxville Register took the day off on Christmas Day, and they had been actually touting the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, gentleman, written by Washington Irving. This was so this, I think, is as close as we have to a smoking gun about Washington Irving's influence on Christmas in Knoxville. But about 25 years later, another writer across the ocean, Charles Dickens, wrote a much better known story today called A Christmas Carol. I just saw the Alistair Sim version of the movie last night. It's a great story, a great movie, a version of the story of an old miser suffering a series of ghost attacks and in the middle of the night that kind of changed his point of view on lots of things. A Christmas Carol not only gave a positive image of Christmas as it did as celebrated by the Cratchits, but also I think maybe more influentially labeled people who don't celebrate Christmas, who don't give their employees the day off, as Scrooges, and nobody wanted to be like Scrooges. So this was kind of a negative influence on people who don't celebrate Christmas. So it was a very influential book, both in England and in America. We see references to it here in Tennessee very soon after it was published. Interestingly, about the time that it was published in America, 1843, 44, there was a reaction among against Christmas, not from secular sources, not from agnostics who said, let's not do this, celebrate this religious holiday, but from fundamentalist Christians who were concerned about this holiday that was really kind of what they considered a corrupt old world Catholic holiday. And there's a fascinating piece I found in a magazine called The Baptist in 1844, published out of Nashville, that said it listed 7 reasons not to celebrate Christmas. And most of them have to do with the fact that Christmas is not specifically described in the Bible, and December 25th has no particular meaning in the Bible, and that was their main reason. But also, they thought a lot of the observances of Christmas, as handed down from the medieval period in Europe, was that it was attended with a fearful amount of reckless mirth and impious feasting. But this was kind of, I think, the last gasp of this anti-Christmas spirit. I think they couldn't bear up anymore from both the interest in Christmas as presented by Dickens, but also at the same time, the 1840s is the time we're getting a lot of immigrants from Europe, from Central Europe, places that Catholic countries that did celebrate Christmas, Germany, Austria, Ireland, Switzerland, and even Italy. We had some of the very first advertisements for Christmas toys is from an Italian vendor who had a shop on Gay Street in 1859, 1860. But it was mainly the Germans who were fascinated with Christmas, loved Christmas, and a guy named Peter Kern, who was one of our best known German immigrants, was one of these people who really touted Christmas and were all in favor of it. Yeah, here's just a couple of early Peter Kern ads from newspapers. Peter Kern at his place on Market Square that we know as the Oliver Hotel. It was a bread bakery, but he also made candy and he sold toys. He sold all sorts of Christmas things, pies and cakes, and fireworks. He sold Christmas fireworks, and this was a part of the Tennessee celebration of Christmas in the post-Civil War era. It's fascinating how many things popped up, how much of our culture was created in a very short time between the end of the Civil War and about 1868 or so. During this short, like 3-year period, we got baseball, we got opera, we got Christmas trees, we got beer. All these things popped up all at once that really had not been part of Knoxville culture before that, and it was mainly these German-speaking immigrants and Irish immigrants too who were carrying the standard for it. But the Germans very specifically wanted to start celebrating Christmas, and were having Christmas decorating parties to show Americans how to celebrate Christmas. And they did these in downtown Knoxville. Had a big, in 1868, I think it was, had a big German Christmas party inviting the whole city to come see how you do it. And so this was all the Tannenbaum. That this was very much, you can almost watch our culture evolving by reading the newspapers of this period. And people just went by the 1870s were going crazy about Christmas. It was interesting. We did just did this story about Knoxville in 1923, and there was a reporter just looking for a story. So thought he started asking the older folks what Christmas was like, and not Peter Kern, but William Rule was one of the older people in town. He was still editor of the Journal and Tribune. He remembered Christmas as it was celebrated here in the 1860s and 70s. And he says, I don't know where this reverence for Christmas has come from because it did not exist except in churches, he said, in the 1860s and 70s, when mainly the name of the game was to blow things up. And we used to have shoot cannons on Christmas, and we'd have hunting parties, and there were all night dances, masquerade dances on New Year's Eve sometimes. It was just a completely different kind of a holiday. But as a holiday that involved a lot of drinking, and it often got out of control. And you can understand when you look at the kind of city Knoxville was. It was a city with a lot of factories, was hiring young men, mainly young men without families, to come here and have and get jobs and somehow make a life for themselves here. And many of them were young men between the ages of 17 and 25 who were working in these factories. And what do they do on their give them money and a day off? And what do? They go to one of the several dozen saloons in downtown Knoxville and get really drunk, and they get in fights, and they shoot each other, and they set off fireworks, and sometimes cause a melee. Paul, we have a picture of Gay Street, don't we, of that era? I'm sorry, we don't have. Look around, see if you have a picture of the Christmas riots of 1893. I've never seen one, but this is where it happened at about the same time. This is a time when there were just mobs in the streets, and they were blowing things up. They actually blew up the front of a bank, amazingly, and set several buildings on fire. This was like on Christmas Eve, fireworks just completely ran amok, and the police could not control it. In fact, the police were beaten and in one case stripped in the streets. This was just kind of a crazy period, and that was looked at afterwards, and the city decided to ban fireworks in the city, and I think that began that tradition of banning fireworks. But this it's something that kind of settled down, I think, as young men grew up and had families. But it still, for many years, it was the most dangerous time of the year, and the murder rate during Christmas week was higher than it ever was any other time of the year. So it's fascinating how this has evolved. By the 20th century, it was developing in different directions. We have a fascinating menu, a Christmas menu up next. People would actually eat out on Christmas Day. And there are a lot of differences, but this is from 1914. Imperial Hotel menu. This is the Imperial Hotel, is where the Farragut was later built, which is now the Hyatt Place on Gay Street. But this is their Christmas dinner menu, and look at that amazing variety of food that they were serving: lobster a la Newburgh, venison steak, currant jelly, but then down Watertown goose, braised Georgia possum. This may be a unique combination of things in one menu, but a lot of Roman punch was a very high, a toxic sort of a thing in those days. Multiple liquors were involved in that, but all sorts of things. Yorkshire pudding, very English. So it's this is, if you want to try to duplicate this, let me know. I would love to see here if someone tried to do this Knoxville Christmas dinner menu. By the way, the same Hotel Imperial was the place that had a bowling alley in the basement. And on Christmas Day, there was a tradition of an all-day bowling tournament. It was mainly run by Germans who did this from the 1890s up to the early 20th century. So that was a thing that people did on Christmas Day. It's kind of funny to think about. What else? But also some things started catching on that stayed here, and one of them was the Christmas tree. Of course, the big public Christmas tree. This is a peculiar shot But this Christmas tree is where the original one was on Market Street, probably just half a block or so from Crouch Park, where it is today. But it was they in 1914 we had a big public Christmas tree, and it was a lot of electricians who were actually sponsored this to build to create the first one, and it caught on, and it's been going on every year for 110 years now. The big public and electrically lit Christmas tree. Uh, but this is a rare picture of a Christmas tree over in the African American part of town at the old Cal Johnson Park, which is now where the Cal Johnson Rec Center is over near the Coliseum. But this was the first probably the first Christmas tree just for Black people in Knoxville in 1922. That was the year they opened the park with Cal Johnson, who had been raised in slavery, was still alive to see this. Um, but next one, please. We one thing about oh yeah, the Lyric Theater is where a lot of stuff happened. This was kind of the center of a great deal of things. This is originally known as Staub's Opera House. I mentioned that opera came in at the same time as Christmas trees and beer and baseball and things. But this was built about right after that period when opera had already gotten here, but we didn't have a place to put it. So Peter Staub, immigrant from Switzerland, built this opera house. It was known as in the 20th century as the Lyric Theater, and had vaudeville shows, and you'd see just a few of those. Those are not particularly famous ones that I'm looking at right now, but they would have vaudeville shows it says opening Christmas matinee. You must not fail to see Lyrics opening. And this was they would have two or sometimes three performances of these vaudeville shows on Christmas Day, and this was just a part of the tradition of Knoxville to go out after a big feast at the Imperial Hotel, perhaps, and then go to a crazy vaudeville show where you might see almost anything. This is something that was showing 100 years ago this week in Christmas. It was the Broken Wing. It was the Perucci Players, which was an Italian origin troupe. That put on this play and did an amazing rendition or recreation of it's a play that was kind of well known and become a movie already, but they on stage they recreated this story, which has to do with an American pilot flying his airplane into a Mexican home, and the woman who lives in the home saves him, and they, despite the language barrier, they fall in love. But they apparently actually recreated this picture of a plane actually crashing into a house, and an amazing spectacle. That was what we refer to as startling spectacles that they had in Knoxville. Laughs, thrills, love, sensational. See the airplane crash through the house. But anyway, that's just an example of all this, and you could see a different show every single day, especially during the Christmas season in Knoxville, because there were several theaters and showing all kinds of different shows, both and also motion pictures as well down the street. So it's there's a lot going on. This is also the early era of radio, and I mentioned, I think last year, that the very first ever radio broadcast was a Christmas broadcast in 1922, and the first broadcast in Knoxville. And it's interesting that this was still going on, and radios were a big item to buy in 1922. Ironically, the radio station that had started in 1922 went out of business at the end of the Christmas season in 1923 because the 21-year-old, who was the only guy who knew how to run the station, got a job in Philadelphia and moved away. So they shut down WNAV, and it was another year and a half or so before WNOX started and became Knoxville became a radio town again. But Knoxville, your radios weren't completely wasted because there were about 4 stations in other big cities as far away as Detroit that you could pick up in Knoxville, and so if you had a radio, you could hear some national broadcasts from big cities up north, and also one in Atlanta. So radio was catching on. It was not as big a deal as it would be 5 years later or so, but it was catching on in 1923. Yeah, here's another vaudeville show that was going on. This is was at the Bijou Theater, called a show called The Clinging Vine, and it was a an interesting show by written by a woman who was named Zelda Sears. But she had written this kind of a farce about gender roles, and I would love to find out more about this play that was showing at the Bijou at Christmas time. Okay, there's something else, all this stuff going on, and there was also a boxing match at the Bijou, which actually was nationally significant later on because it involved a guy who was later a heavyweight contender. But there's so many things going on that very much more quietly up on the top floor of the Burwell building, which is the tall building in front of the Tennessee Theater, at Judge Hugh Lindsay's office. There were a bunch of guys that got together to work with a woman's idea. Annie Davis had this idea after a trip out west to Yosemite with her husband Willis, who was one of the movers and shakers in Knoxville at the time, was in charge of the Knoxville Iron Company, but was a much respected businessman. And he loved his wife's idea and talked to the big shots of Knoxville and said, "Let's make this work. Let's build the first big national park east of the Rocky Mountains." And this was literally what they did. There was only one national park east of the Rocky Mountains. It was a small one up in Maine, but the Smoky Mountains was a much more ambitious project. What, 500,000 acres of the borderland between Tennessee and North Carolina. But they got together up in the Burwell building and began talking about this, and had the people in the room included Judge Hugh Lindsay, who hosted it, Cowan Rogers, the guy that introduced automobiles to Knoxville, was at that time one of our most prosperous automobile dealers, in charge of the Knoxville Automobile Club, which was very much interested in having places to drive to. And Daniel Cleary Webb, who was the father of our old friend Bob Webb, who founded Webb School much later. And of course, Colonel David Chapman was in there, and he was a pharmaceutical executive, but also a hiker and a lover of the Smokies. And he was the guy that ended up, even though he was not necessarily the key figure in the room that day, within a year or two, he was the leader of the whole effort to create the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and was considered the father of the Smokies today. And Mount Chapman is named for him, as well as Chapman Highway, and lots of he's very well remembered. There's a bust of him in the History Center today, but he was in that room while all this stuff was happening, and all that happened 100 years ago today. Today, December 21st, is the centennial of the foundation of the Great Smoky Mountains Conservation Association, which still exists to this day. But in the early days, it was the main main organizer of the Smoky Mountains National Park before it was turned over to the federal government eventually. But anyway, an early picture of Mount LeConte. They mentioned Jim Thompson and his brother Robin, who was an aerial photographer, in that meeting 100 years ago today, about how much their great pictures of the Smokies, could be used to promote this national park idea, and that was turned out to be very successful. It was in a very short time that politicians were fascinated with this idea. One of our U.S. senators and our local congressman, by the end of the year, just days after this meeting, were saying, "Yes, let's do this." And okay, back to Christmas. This is an early Christmas scene. We have the Christmas, public Christmas tree. By 1928, we have the Christmas parade. And if you look carefully, those are not horses, those are not cows, those are reindeer on Gate Street. And I would love to find out more about how that worked. But this is I think the very first known Santa Claus parade. I don't know that I saw the parade this year. I don't know that I saw reindeer pulling Santa Claus this year, but that's an interesting tradition that maybe didn't catch on. But it was like an Inuit or something leading the reindeer in front of them there. Next one, please. And Adolf Schmid, by the way, is the son of a Swiss immigrant who took some of the early great public movies of Knoxville. And here's a much later Santa Claus parade with big Macy's size floats going down. down the street. And of course, that Howard Baker for congressman, that Howard Baker's that we remember as his father was our congressman at that time, and some more. Yeah, that's a kind of crazy creature on the left there, a giant dragon or hippopotamus or something. I can't tell what it is, but of course that 1950 Santa Claus really enjoying himself in his moment in the public spotlight. All right, we have something unusual tonight, which I think I expect a lot of people came out to see this. This is Charles Barber, one of our best known architects, born in 1887 near Chicago, but spent most of his life in Knoxville. His father was the famous architect George Barber, who had a very different kind of career from Charles Barber's. Charles Barber loved to do revivalist architecture, old Gothic revivalist architecture, especially, and you see his work all over town, especially at UT campus. Especially at along Kingston Pike and Sequoia Hills. Well, he lived in a few places in town. He lived in Fountain City at one time, but he eventually built his own house in South Knoxville, just west of Alcoa Highway, and that house is still a home, and it's occupied by an attorney named John Butler, and he found while rummaging around in the attic, found a little packet of interesting papers, letters, and things, and turned them over to realtor Jennifer Montgomery, who was interested and shared them with the Knoxville History Project, and we were fascinated to look at these old, many of them were old Christmas cards, and they were beautiful old Christmas cards. But we couldn't help but notice that most of the Christmas cards had not been opened. These were sealed Christmas cards that most of the others had been opened with a the knife on the top. But these were about 50 cards were just never opened by Charlie Barber or anybody else, and we were fascinated but kind of intimidated by this prospect of opening mail intended for someone who died 60 years ago. So we brought in some members of Charlie Barber's family, including Chaz Barber, who we've known for years as an old friend of ours, and they sat in here and very carefully and respectfully opened all these Christmas cards after 86 years that had been waiting to be opened. And they were beautiful. They're gorgeous. You'll see that in a minute. We're going to show some images of these Christmas cards that were sent to Charlie Barber. Many of them were not from close friends of his. A few of them were, but a lot of them were just from vendors. And it's not that surprising that he didn't prioritize opening them. In 1937, he was at the peak of his career. He was doing a lot of designing of buildings, schools and UT buildings and other things. So he was may have just been too busy to open Christmas cards, but he was. But anyway, we opened them, and I think he might have regretted that he didn't open some of these because they're gorgeous. Let's look at some of these. Here's some of them. They're all very much of their era, and you can see the lettering from this, kind of the font of this Merry Christmas. It's very 1937. It couldn't have been 1940s. It couldn't have been 1920s, but just 1937. And here's this was amazing because Charles Barber was so well known. He lived in Fountain City in 1937. All he had to do was write his name in Fountain City in Tennessee. No zip code, no street number, no street, just Charles Barber. And he got this, he received this. And here's Charles Barber, even more vague, Charles Barber, architect, if you can read that abbreviation for architect. And no Fountain City, just Knoxville, Tennessee. That's it. From Chattanooga. It got from Chattanooga and ended up in Charles Barber's hands, even if he didn't open it. Anyway, it's that's interesting just to see those addresses. And here's that one again. We just looked at. Let's move on. Yeah, here's another one, just very high style. That looks like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and about to break out into dancing there. That's something very much of its time. But just look at those colors. And here's another one, a lot of snowy scenes here. And here's what I was talking about, these vendors, acoustical contractors. These are people who'd either worked with Charles Barber or were hoping to work with him. So he just didn't he didn't prioritize opening some of these letters. But this is it's still a lovely scene. Yeah, here's a really stylish one of the silhouettes in front of the fireplace, and those people just look very sophisticated, 1930s sophisticated people, and who couldn't have been 10 years earlier or 10 years later. That's very 1937. Okay, this is an interesting lady. I didn't know anything about her when we found this. This is an unusual image of a woman, presumably Helen Smithson. I thought, why do you send a picture of yourself? We found out a good deal about her, and I did some research just to find out about her. Helen Smithson was a young woman who was a paraplegic. She had been in a car wreck at the age of 12 and had never been able to move her legs after that. She lived most of her life in the Fort Sanders area at 2115 Wyatt Avenue. And she, in 1937, was only 19 years old, but was to some extent self-sustaining as a typist. She was a professional typist and actually typed term papers for UT students. And I don't know if there were still people like that when I was in college. I don't know if there still are, but she became an advocate for the disabled in the 1930s. She founded something that she called the Shut-In Society, which seems kind of a misnomer in her case because she was not a shut-in. She hosted parties at her house and was well known around town. George Dempster, the inventor and at the time city manager, was a great admirer of hers. And he called her group the Wheelchair Brigade. We might think of that as inappropriate today, but that's what he was a great admirer of what she was doing. And amazingly, she was still around into the 21st century. I found a feature about her in 2006 at the age of 90 or so. She was advocating for computers for the disabled because she thought that would change their lives for disabled people to have computers and be able to stay connected to the world. So a remarkable woman whose name we should have known before, but did not. And just lucky that she sent Charlie Barber a card, whether he saw it or not. It gave her a chance to learn something about her. All right, here's another it's one of the very few biblical cards, but a shepherd, but a very high style shepherd by 1930 standards, with that kind of porthole image that reminds you of a Esther Rogers musical. All right, here's a cool kind of a darker card and a Currier and Oz sort of shot, but still interestingly artistic, I think, card. And it's kind of surprising that and when they were talking about Christmases of the past in 1923, back in the 1870s, people were saying, gosh, I don't know what it was, but we used to have a lot more snow then. And there actually were sleigh parties here in Knoxville at Christmas time in the 1870s. And I don't. These are just vague memories of older people, but that they said, the sleigh bells and the sleigh, all that was part of a Knoxville Christmas at one time. All right, here's a funny, a bearer of good cheer. But there are a lot of little bears here, and it's interesting that the bears could possibly influenced by the interest in the Smoky Mountains National Park movement, which was really going full bore in the 1930s. It already formally opened in 1934 after 11 years after the meeting on Gay Street was finally opened. And Charlie Barber was a big fan of the mountains. He loved hiking in the mountains. So it's not surprising that more than a few of these cards have little black bears in them. And here's that inside. But this one is signed by an interesting guy named Doc Jennison, who Paul had knew something about more about than I did. But he was a professor of botany at UT, and was the kind of the official Smokies. I think the botanical technician or something. An official role with the Smoky Mountains National Park. But he was actually there's something in that card that he mentions. We're going to do a bear census soon, and I think he and Charlie Barber together. Wait till we go on that bear census trip. They were Charlie Barber apparently had offered to help him count the bears in that national park, which is something they try to keep in track of then and still do today. But Jennison did a lot of work in just both in plant life and animal life about looking at the incredible diversity of life in the Smoky Mountains. Sadly, he lasted only 2 years after he sent that card. He died very suddenly after collapsing with a heart attack on campus in 1940, early 1940. All right, here's a kind of a fun one, kind of an interactive 1937 Christmas card. Let's look at that one, and now let's look at the next one. Here, you open it up and you see a couple of dogs in there, and you find out that the dogs are removable and have their own little sayings. Happiness for Christmas Day. May the season be glad from beginning to end. But really cute cards. I've never seen a card just like that. And here's another sort of a dog. Christmas is going to the dogs, but that's another funny one. Yeah, and here's a really look at that color, and a lot of books I give. I don't know whether people appreciate it or not, but I give often 100% of my gifts are books every year. I was glad to learn that the first gifts ever given in Knoxville that I know of were books in the 1840s and 50s. But this is a really great image of some books, and with that rich red color. I don't ever see that color in my life, in my regular life, or those blues and greens. Those seem like colors they made in the 1930s and just don't make anymore. But the great thing is these have been sealed up all this time, so they haven't been touched by sunlight over these years, and that's the original color. And here's another just a high style image of a house in the country covered with snow. An A-frame, I guess Charlie Barber would think of it. Yeah, here's a kind of an unusual card. This is one of the very few that shows some age because it shows some glue coming through the image, but still an interesting image of a candle. Another snowy scene out the window. Okay, here's the Post Sign Company, and this is a special to us because we are the custodians of the Post Sign Company's photograph collection. The Post Sign Company lasted for about 60 years or so. It was a major company for billboards and other kinds of signage, permanent signage that all over town you would see Post Sign Company stuff. And we have in our collection, the KHP collection, images of a lot of they took pictures of all the signs and saved them to be able to talk about them. And we have all the Post Sign Company pictures in our collection. By the way, Post Sign Company was one of the earliest employers of the artist Buford Delaney, who when they had their office on Gay Street, he worked with the Post Sign Company painting signs. All right, here's another just very, very stylish 1930s image here. Hear ye, Happy New Year. And not a Christmas card, it's just a Happy New Year card. But it looks Christmassy, it looks very Dickensian, and more old-fashioned one with a woman doing needlepoint and a cat with her ball of yarn beneath her. And Christmas greetings, look at that lettering, very kind of like, I guess we'd call it Art Deco era lettering, and more of that kind of idealized coach and horses. And very those lines that's a very very much of that era. That's not early 30s, that's not early 40s, that's 1937. That's exactly, they really captured the aesthetic of that era. Right, another one, kind of an idealistic image of people sleigh riding to church, and an amazingly tall, sharp steeple. It looks kind of like the old Baptist church that we tore down in the 20s on Gay Street. But with that, essentially that steeple and the planet behind it, whatever that is, the moon, I guess, looks a lot like what was in 1939, the New York World's Fair with the trialon and the perisphere. That the trialon, the really tall, pointy object, and the perisphere, the sphere that went together, and that may just be coincidental, but it just made me think of that, and that was the same, the same end of the same decade. All right, this is one of the coolest ones that I saw. Look at that late 1930s car. Even though you can't tell what kind of car it is, maybe a Packard or something. It's covered with snow. You can't even see a lot of the detail of it, but it's very much a car of its time. And with these dark house and the red lit windows in it, a very simple image, but there's a lot to kind of take in there. Even so, it's a fascinating picture. If I had a big image of that, I might hang it up here in the office. In fact, we might do that. But it's a very cool 1937 picture. All right, and here's some more kind of Art Deco looking stuff. A big round, almost a perisphere of a Santa Claus with a couple of urban shoppers. But the Santa Claus, of course, is ringing bells for the Salvation Army, and that's what I think most of the Santa Claus you would see in Knoxville were doing something similar. Very stylish, but yeah. And here's a kind of a more old-fashioned image, but still lovely to greet you at Christmas. All right, Southern Gypsum Products. This is one of those vendors that was trying to curry favor with Charlie Barber, one of the most influential architects in East Tennessee. And some more dogs. Terriers were very much in fashion, and we talked about that at the Maple Hall. Of course, the Thin Man had a terrier, and the President of the United States had Fala, the terrier dog. But that was a very stylish Boston Terrier, perhaps stylish kind of dog in the 1930s. Another Connor Steel. I found Connor Steel was a Birmingham-based steel company. And so this, his Charlie Barber's influence stretched a long way, and they were hoping to get work with Charlie Barber by sending him this card. And here's the card itself. But here's Santa Claus forging it looks like some runners for a sleigh. Somebody's got to do it. All right, and here's another forge image, hammer and tong and a bit of song. May the new year weld success and build for you the whole year through a house of happiness. That's something for an architect, isn't it? But health, happiness, prosperity, success, friendship, all the basic ingredients. And Santa Claus there, a Merry Xmas. It's interesting. Xmas was very common, and actually was used more commercially for beginning the 1870s and 80s, and kind of fell out of favor in the 1960s when people thought it was taking the Christ out of Christmas. But I think it was. There are a couple of stories about that. One is that people didn't like to see the word Christ in something that was commercial, and that was why they put an X, which is actually the Greek character, the first letter in Christ. So they would spell it that way. But it might have just been a way to save letters in some cases. All right, here's another very, very, very stylish, very 1937 and very, very terrier image. And another snowy house scene. A lot of house pictures, and I don't know if people thought about that when they send these to Charlie Barber or not, but there are probably more houses in these Christmas card collections than most of us get in our Christmas cards sent to us. And here's an image from the mountains of a snowy creek. At least it looks like the mountains. That's, if you've ever seen a creek in the snow, that's of course what it looks like. Probably something that appealed to Smoky's hikers. Another more old-fashioned image, this stagecoach in the snow. And greetings. This looks like a work of art, doesn't it? From France or Spain of the time, the 1920s, 30s. It's just a lovely piece. I wish I knew who painted it, but it's someone who not only was able to do commercial art, but was kind of interested in the art of the era. And kind of a funny one. I would love to know more about this. I tried to do some research on this, the towns. It says Emily and Cal. It looks like the word Cal is backwards. But I tried to look up Emily towns and didn't get very far. If anybody knows anything about them, let us know. I would just be curious about that. Just kind of an unusual, kind of a spontaneous, sort of intuitive sort of design on that card. Perhaps by somebody who did it themselves, but knew how to do that sort of thing. And a especially lovely another outdoor house scene. This one very rural looking, and another Maud and Guy and family. We don't know who those were. Maud and Guy and family. All right, is that it, Paul?
Yes.
All right, we're very much glad to get to show those to you, and I'm glad we were able to. And thanks to Mr. Butler and to Jennifer Montgomery for getting these cards to us. This has been kind of a special and unusual opportunity for us to get to share them. Any questions? Yeah, as someone mentions, Bears and Scotties. There are they were both very popular in the 30s. Bears mainly in this part of the country, but Scotties nationally. Merry Christmas! Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, folks.